Hello, I'm Ted Gamble, Chair of the British Architectural Library Trust. The Trust is the nonprofit entity that supports the extraordinary library and collections of the Royal Institute of British Architects in London. This is the third presentation in our four-part 2025 lecture series, The Architecture of Transport in Britain. Today's lecture is entitled St Pancras Transformed, the story of Britain's greatest railway building. The lecture will be presented by the respected editor and author Simon Bradley. Simon was born in Newcastle upon Tyne and studied at Oxford and the Courtauld Institute of Art. He has written for the Times Literary Supplement, the London Review of Books, the Spectator, the Guardian, the Evening Standard, and Architectural History. Simon is the editor of the world-famous Buildings of England series, founded by Nicholas Pesar, to which he has contributed a number of notable volumes. His interest in railways began by train spotting at age 11. His latest book is Bradley's Railway Guide, a journey through 2 centuries of British railway history, 1825 to 2025, which was designated a Sunday Times Book of the Week. His book, The Railways, Nation, Network, and People, explores the remarkable history and character of Britain's railways. It was named the History Book of the Year by the Sunday Times and was shortlisted for the Longman History Prize. The London Review of Books called Simon's book on St Pancras Station, quote, an elegant, well-illustrated love letter to one of London's most instantly recognizable landmarks, close quote. Today, we will be the beneficiaries of Simon's thoughtful observations on railways, architecture, and social history. The interlocutor for the lecture is architectural writer, editor, and consultant Hugh Pearman. Hugh currently serves as a trustee and chairman of C20, the 20th Century Society. For 30 years, Hugh served as the architecture and design critic of the Sunday Times and has been a frequent contributor to numerous other publications as well, including The Guardian, The Observer, The Wall Street Journal, and The New York Times. He has edited the RIBA Journal from 2006 to 2020. He was an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. He has served on Arts Council England's advisory group and chaired the Art for Architecture initiative at the Royal Society of Arts. He also serves on the Trust Advisory Council of the British Architectural Library Trust. He was served as a visiting professor of architecture at the Royal College of Art and as honorary vice president of the Architectural Association in London. Following Simon's lecture, Hugh will join him for further conversation. And now it's my privilege to introduce Simon Bradley.
Well, thank you, Ted, and thank you all for joining. So, Britain's greatest railway building. Well, I have to persuade you of that, don't I? I've already made up my mind. Here we see, as an opener, a late 19th century painting, which gives you something of the initial impact that the arrival of St Pancras Station would have had on London, this extraordinary neo-Gothic soaring composition rising out of the rooftops and the smoke. And here we see it again. This is a mid-20th century aerial view. Here's St Pancras. Immediately you see there are the 2 major parts. There is the train shed, rather sort of downbeat term used for the covered or shelter that protects the railway platforms. And there is the station building, which for shorthand we'll call the hotel, because it is it was largely built as a hotel. The whole thing built for the Midland Railway in 1866 to 76. In fact, the building is used for other things too, but hotel for shorthand. And next to it, and this is important, to the east is King's Cross Station. This is an earlier railway terminus built for the Great Northern Railway in the early 1850s. And you see already the difference in scale and ambition between those 2 buildings, with barely a decade and a half between them. And the key people at St Pancras, here they are. They're all remarkably close in age when you see their dates laid out like that. On the left, Sir James Allport. He was the visionary general manager of the Midland Railway. In the middle, William Henry Barlow, the Midland Railway's consulting engineer, also a man very active in other fields as an engineer, so an eminent figure in his field. And on the right, and most famous really, Sir George Gilbert Scott, the great architect also of, well, how long have you got? The Albert Memorial, the Foreign Office, scores of restorations of cathedrals and other buildings, hundreds really of restorations of medieval churches across Britain. The architect of works in Germany, in India, in Australia, the man with the largest architectural office, employing the most architects or pupils, assistants of anyone of his time. So something like the profile of maybe a major 20th century architect already, but it's very much at the peak of his profession. Also a scholar, an author, a theorist, if you like, of architecture. He never seems to have rested a moment and achieved an extraordinary amount in his time through the ability to delegate, the ability to organize things efficiently. Altogether a phenomenon. And behind the commission was the Midland Railway's own ambitions. It had begun as a sort of amalgamation of local lines in the English Midlands in the 1840s. There were lots of similar sort of regional companies, you might call them, but the Midland wanted to grow and insisted on growing, and it therefore built both northwards up to Carlisle, where it could enter into alliance with Scottish companies, run right the way through to Glasgow, Edinburgh and beyond, and also it forged a new main line south to London. So the St Pancras was built as the Midland Railway's terminus in London, muscling in, if you like. There were already two main lines up to the north from London, the Great Northern and another one running from Euston Station just to the west, the London and North Western Railway. So the Midland is the newcomer, the disruptor. It has to make itself stand out. It does this in various ways. It has difficulty competing in terms of speed or of cheapness in terms of its service to passengers, but it does very well in competing on comfort and quality. And having a lavish and splendid new building in London was part of that image making, if you like. It's in character with the Midland under Allport that it was the first British company to import Pullman cars from the US as a way of showing how luxurious and well appointed railway carriages could be. And here we see the two stations again, a beautifully detailed Ordnance Survey map from late 19th century. So here's St Pancras, and there's King's Cross. One other thing to point out, as well as the lines above ground, just visible is the outline of a tunnel. Now, this is a Midland Railways tunnel. It runs in a great sweep beneath the site of the station, and here it joins the Metropolitan Railway, which is running underneath the road. Now, that tunnel is important, and we'll keep coming back to it. And a little more about King's Cross. Here it is in a watercolor around the time of its completion. It's not quite as built as depicted there, but it's very close. And as you'll see, it is an austere, plain, beautifully legible sort of building. You have the twin train sheds behind these arches. They run right the way back behind. The building is designed by an architect, Louis Cubitt, but in terms of its historical accounts, it's sometimes been muddled with an engineer. They were saying this is engineer's architecture almost. In fact, not. He was an architect, but he had, if you might call it, an engineer's sensibility when it came to designing this. There are little touches of architectural ornament, of course, here and there, but it is extremely plain and austere. What it doesn't have is a hotel incorporated. The Great Northern Railway built a hotel a little later and to the left. So in that sense, it is a rather different animal from St Pancras, where the hotel is incorporated and to some degree integrated with the structure. That point is worth remembering too. And just to see a little more of King's Cross, this is a section through it looking southwards now. Twin train sheds, 105 feet across, so this is not small or negligible at all. This is a grand building. The material, incidentally, of the main arches, it was not what you might expect, which at this stage might be wrought iron. It was laminated timber. this was a cheaper way of doing it. It proved to be a short-term thing, if you like. They had to be replaced within a few decades, and they were replaced in iron. But by the time King's Cross was built, then these arched train sheds were already spreading across the country. Newcastle has one. Brunel supplied one for Paddington, also in the early 1850s, and these are surviving buildings with the original wrought iron train sheds. So wrought iron would be the expectation. King's Cross is rather the exception. And another view of King's Cross, here we see that frontage again, Lewis Cubitt's frontage, very obliquely. And just ahead over here is the future site of St Pancras Station. What's happening in the foreground? Well, this is the excavation for the Metropolitan Railway, the world's first underground railway, which opened in 1863. And it's quite close to the surface. So most of it is built on what was called cut and cover principle. You dig a sort of giant trench, you build your railway, you cover it over with a brick vault, and then you cover the ground over again. They tend to follow roads because roads give you a clear route through the city. Extremely disruptive, of course, but nonetheless, that was the model adopted in London and in some other cities too. So you can see that because the railway isn't very close, it isn't very far below the surface, then it's relatively easy to run a line through from the main railway and to connect with it. Now, this matters because the Midland Railway isn't just seeking to bring people in and out of London. It also has a great deal of freight and goods to carry, especially coal. So by running its freight trains, coal trains through and linking with the Metropolitan Railway, it can then take them through London and off to markets beyond. So freight and passenger, well, in terms of the economics, then actually freight is the more important. Now, of course, it's generally the other way around. And another factor already in place, the Regent's Canal, so an early 19th century creation. I've marked it there in its course in red. It's right in the way of anyone trying to come into London by train, unfortunately, for the railway engineers. So at King's Cross, the solution was to go under it. So the lines slope down quite steeply from the mouth of the station. They go into a tunnel and they re-emerge beyond. This solves the problem, but it was difficult operationally. The trains, steam-hauled locomotives or steam locomotives, struggled, especially early ones, to get up steep inclines. It was easier to have a level route, as Brunel managed at Paddington, and as Barlow managed when it came to build at St Pancras. But he did it not by going under, but by raising the whole route up. So the approach is, much of it is on viaduct or on bridges. There you can see it bridging the canal. And it means that the whole platform deck at the station is raised quite high above surrounding street level, actually about 20 feet up. This was similar to what was done at some of the termini which had been built in the early 1860s when railways started springing across the River Thames and being built on the North Bank. So Charing Cross, Cannon Street, and so on, likewise with a raised approach. So what form to take? Here Barlow rather helpfully laid out his sort of train of thought and his problem solving in a talk to the Institution of Civil Engineers. So we've got his account of the structure on the record. There you see in section or the train shed structure. This is one of the working drawings for when it went out to contract in 1866. The width of the site was limited by public streets on either side. There was certainly space there for a grand twin-arched train shed, but Barlow chose not to do that, and he explains why. One reason was that tunnel I already mentioned running beneath the site. That was already built, and if a spine wall running down the middle, as would have been needed for a twin train shed, had been chosen, then that would have been potentially problematic in terms of its reinforcement, in terms of possible distortion or deflection. It would certainly have made it a more complicated and difficult thing to build. So Barlow began to think of a single span, a huge single span, and began to see the advantages of that. One advantage was about drainage. You have to get the water off the roof. If you've got a valley gutter running down the middle, then you have to supply a quite complicated system of water courses and pipes and all the rest of it, make sure that the rainwater runs out somewhere. But if you have it in a single structure like an upturned boat, then of course it just runs down the sides, and from there it's very easily conveyed away through street drains. So that's one advantage. Another concerns what happens to an iron structure or an iron or steel structure when exposed to changes in the weather. Of course, it expands and contracts. There are various ways of dealing with that. By the mid-19th century, such things as sort of roller bearings were known and could be placed, and as structures expanded, contracted, then they could, they wouldn't be disruptive to their masonry housings or supports. The advantage here, though, is by having this raised deck and by linking the great truss through the base of the deck, then that part is buried and that part is no longer exposed to such extremes of temperature. So that part is effectively stable. And the expansion and contraction of the rest, the part which is exposed to direct sunlight and the rest, can be contained, and it would rise and fall slightly, the point of the arch, but would not have the same disruptive or potentially destructive force at the edges, pushing against the walls or the side supports. So that's an advantage too. And by having a simply easily replicated form of support, in other words, minimizing the number of castings or forgings needed to create that deck, then that's another saving as well. Barlow claimed that there was a saving of about 20% by going for the larger, more complex, and more ambitious structure, as opposed to having a twin train shed. Well, I mean, one might contest the figure, but it's his way of saying, this isn't a great money spinning extravagance. This is actually an economically sensible solution, as well as a good engineering-led solution. In terms of that multiplication of units, it's striking that Barlow was involved together with another engineer called Ordish, who was also consulted at St Pancras, with the discussions of the Crystal Palace design in 1851, this famously modular, mass-produced building from a very small number of components, and a similar train of thought at play here. Now, the spacing of those uprights in the basement was determined in a rather beautiful and elegant way. As well as all the coal which the Midland wanted to bring to London, it also had a great amount of beer, because it was the railway that ran to Burton-on-Trent, the great brewing town, which produced a very good brew for which there was a great market in the south. And there were already big warehouses built in Burton and elsewhere, designed to house that product in its barrels, which were of a standard size. And they produced a module, if you like, of 29 feet 4 inches. That was a multiple of 3 of the Burton beer casks. And so Barlow said, well, this is the best way to use the space. We can put beer in here, and we can make it into a great beer warehouse. And therefore, the spacing of the girders follows that of the existing beer warehouses, and the spacing of the trusses is a multiple of, when you see the structure in section here, then you have 2 of those units for every span, for every bay of the train shed. So as he put it, the length of a beer barrel became the unit of measure upon which all the arrangements of this floor were based. And we'll see a bit of that basement later. And here you see the structure beginning to rise. The strange object in the foreground is the Fleet River, effectively by then a sort of underground drain, and that had to be contained and carried through the site, another challenge for the engineer. But you can see those trusses, or the stubs of them, just starting to rise, and then further back, the already completed trusses and the great crisscross timber staging, a movable scaffold that was used to support it, and the scaffolding moved forward a bay, and then another truss was built, and so on. So this is 1866. And there we see it complete. This was the widest clear span structure yet built by about 20 feet, 25 feet or so. The dimension is 245 feet 6 inches. The length 689 feet. So truly vast. I mean, anyone who saw it would be immediately struck by this was the largest space, if you like, that they'd ever been in. And there you see the way the end is closed part of the way down by a screen. This great space had other advantages. It was flexible in use. You could move the tracks if you wanted to put in platforms in a different place, or tracks in a different place. It was well ventilated because, of course, we're dealing with smoky, steamy steam locomotives here. And another view that captures the height of it as well. Not only was it the widest clear span structure, it was also the tallest train shed yet built. I think the tallest, perhaps, enclosed space of its kind, 104 feet. The little points you may wonder about. Barlow, is it to look Gothic? Why is it pointed? Well, Barlow explained that as a way of strengthening it for wind resistance. Although, in fact, when similar train sheds were built, they more often adopted round or segmental profiles. So perhaps that wasn't entirely essential. And also for comparison, well, this is a somewhat earlier train shed, Birmingham New Street. This is another way of having a very wide span. This is, in this instance, 212 feet. Now, so at the time, this was the world's widest clear span structure. But the form adopted shows something of the aesthetic advantages of the system Barlow used, the sort of bowstring with the buried horizontal element tying together the arches, buried or embedded in the masonry structure. This is what's known as a sickle truss roof. You can imagine it, perhaps visually, sort of pulling it apart with your eyes, that there are these very thin girders running across it. Each then has a thinner, sort of rather spidery membrane of ties running below it. So the flexing element, the expanding element of each girder is contained by that lower network, that lower tie. So it's effective, it's cheap. Visually, it's, well, it has a certain sort of thrilling complexity, but you could say untidy, messy. That wasn't the point, of course. These weren't buildings primarily for aesthetic effect, but there is certainly a power and a clarity in the solution Barlow adopted, which is an aesthetic gain. And just to take the story forward, this is the building no longer extant, which took the record for the widest clear span structure from St Pancras. This is Penn Station at Jersey City, built in 1888. 10 feet wider than St Pancras. Not pointed, you'll notice, but the basic structural concept is the same. There's rather more open plan or open work girders or trusses here, but the tie runs below the tracks once again, so similar in that sense. And just to look at the basement there, you see the basement plan and the very insistent sort of pattern of those cast uprights supporting the platform deck. Just here, there was a little hydraulic lift, and that was how the wagons with the beer in were lowered into the basement. So one at a time. I mean, slow, cumbersome, but there's a lot of cheap labor available at the time, and it worked. And here it is seen from above, looking down from the very top of that train shed, that little platform there. Wagons a beer train would be shunted along here, one wagon at a time, then lowered into the basement, and then it would be moved by hydraulic power through the basement, and could be unloaded there. So there are beer barrels and other cargoes. This is a sort of mid-20th century view. So this traffic went on until the early 1960s. So now onto the station building, the hotel. Here we have a modern plan giving you the outlines. You can see effectively there's a route through here. That was the arrival route for road vehicles. There's a route through there coming off the platform decks around here. That was where incoming traffic vehicles would go out. So these are people, but also the other cargoes that come on the passenger train, so newspapers, post, perishables, things like that. So this is a busy building. Here, this is part of the hotel. So there's the street entrance to the hotel, and then various steps and routes through the hotel to get you up to higher level. And we'll see this plan again later. But one point of showing the plan, the rate at which the building was constructed and the phasing of it meant that the design of the hotel was effectively fixed by the time it went to competition, because it was a competition project won by Scott. So the wing here running down to the street, the placing of these arches, the position of the ramp running up, a sort of double ramp. Now these things weren't up for negotiation. If you entered the competition, these decisions had already been made for you by the engineer and indeed by the contractors who were already starting work on it. So it's in that sense quite a relatively constrained competition. You had to design an informal or at least asymmetrical building. There was no way of making a great big classical composition here, even if you'd wanted to. And there we see it, and there we see that double ramp, and as recently restored with stone blocks and steps. The competition was in 1865. And Scott was invited to enter. He hadn't actually entered it originally, but the Midland clearly wanted him to enter. There was a suggestion that they also wanted him to win because they wanted the building by the top architect of the day. Well, in favor of that suspicion, he went £50,000 over the second most expensive design. Actually, he went sort of over the guidelines, but they went for him anyway. So there is perhaps a certain strong possibility that the Midland were determined to have Scott and to have this sort of prestige architect. Unfortunately, the other designs, they've nearly all been lost. There is just one perspective surviving, but we know who the entrants were, and there are a few written descriptions. But there is even the one surviving view doesn't show this side, so we can't see what the architect would have made of those fixed points, the entrance and the entrance and exit arches, and the great curving wing, and so forth. And so you see how the phasing happened, as at King's Cross, where the hotel was built later. So here, your first thing to do is to get your station operational, start bringing in some return for your investment on this great construction. And then after that, you add the hotel and begin to draw on that traffic, that source of custom. The section here, well, originally it was going to be part of the hotel. But then the railway decided it would need more of it itself for its own uses and purposes, waiting rooms, parcel offices, and the like. So that explains, well, here it's captured with that first phase approaching completion. But then there was, it took longer to complete the hotel part, in fact, not completed until 1876. And we can see also that the trusses are designed with some Gothic detailing there. These are Barlow's trusses. They have a sort of quatrefoil, is it, or anyway, open work foliated cast design in the spandrels there, which is sort of in harmony with Scott's Gothic, neo-Gothic walls. So that's within the train shed. There must have been some close consultation. And there's all this happening very, very quickly, from Scott winning the competition and his design being agreed and the start of work. So they would have been working hand in glove. That shows you the design which won the competition. It's spectacular. It's even more spectacular than what was built because it has one extra story. This is when the Midland Railway was thinking it would move its main office to London. What happened then in 1866 was a great financial crash, which spooked everybody and in fact put some big railway companies out of business. It wasn't a time for unnecessary expenditure. But the Midland kept its nerve. It kept its offices in Derby, where they were already, and it stripped out that one floor. But it went ahead and built at least the first section of the hotel. It was built from there to there in, I think, 1869 when it opened. Then the rest of the hotel took a while to complete and to add on. So there you see it as completed. You may feel it's a better composition for having lost that extra story. Certainly the tower at this southeastern corner stands out more proudly as a result. The added wing here, which completed the hotel, contains most of the hotel's grandest interiors. And this represented another challenge for Scott when the railway said, well, we're now going to build the hotel in 2 phases. He had to build phase 1, this section, with all of the things the hotel needed, despite the fact that the many of the grandest rooms, dining rooms and so on, were going to be in the other bit. So they had to think of a use for the rooms after they'd ceased to have their initial use, had to make the kitchens work, even though, you know, more of the kitchens were actually over in the new wing. All of this happened somehow. There's very little record of the chopping and changing, but Scott seems to have, and his big, you know, well equipped office seems to have taken it all in his stride. We can move on to some of the detail. Scott was. It's fair to say he's a sort of theorist of the Gothic revival as well as a practitioner, and the building in many ways is a realization of some program he'd put forward in a book called Remarks on Secular and Domestic Architecture, published in 1857. Here he says, well, Gothic is the do anything style, the go anywhere style. You can compose informally in it. I mean, clearly here we have a very unclassical composition. You can mix and match elements and inspirations from it. Here, the general composition is derived from, I suppose, the great town halls and guild halls of the Low Countries, sort of, Brussels, Bruges. But when you come to look at the details, well, these are more French or English, Anglo-French, 13th century or a century or so earlier, couple of centuries earlier than the great late medieval Low Countries buildings. And also he's using modern materials. He's using plate glass. These aren't, medieval casements at all. These are modern buildings. And he embraces plate glass for such buildings. He says so in his book. You know, this is a great invention. Let's make use of it. Gothic can take it. It can find a place in Gothic. And the carving, some of it really, I mean, perhaps one wouldn't mistake this for medieval carving. It's something more of the modern contemporary Gothic revival. He used a firm called Farmer and Brindley, very good architectural carvers, a sort of forcing house for lots of young sculptors, actually. You might start your career there. And he used the same firm for some of his great church works. So he's using the very best people. This also shows the variety of materials used, what is often called structural polychromy, the use of differently colored materials for aesthetic effect. So not painted decoration or anything like that. The color is intrinsic to the material. Important part of the Gothic revival theory or ideology that this should be a building that tells the truth about its own structure. This would be familiar from Pugin and from Ruskin and others, perhaps. So here we see the stripes of the voussoirs of the arches, a North Italian motif, the brick and stone used together in contrasting tones and colors. But we also see the different stones used. There's a red sandstone here at the top, and then a finer stone here, a creamy limestone. Now, these materials were sourced from across the Midland Railway's own territory, Lancashire and Yorkshire, Nottinghamshire, bringing stuff in. And there was an obvious economic advantage in doing that. The railway was its own customer. And for the ironwork too, this is perhaps you can just read Derbyshire at the bottom. These are the base of the main trusses in the train shed. So it's bringing Midland Railway building materials to London. To some extent, it's a sort of an advertisement. You know, you can order these too. And the creation of a more national market in building materials is one of the effects that the railways have on architecture. Things become less local, less distinctive, less vernacular in that sense. And Scott is also using iron very boldly. This is within one of those two big arches, the entrance and the exit arch. Those run through 2 stories. Therefore, there needs to be a way of keeping the first floor communicating. And this is the answer. There are these cast iron Gothic sort of covered bridges running through. And cast iron inside as well. The most spectacular of all the interiors, one of the most spectacular staircases in London, in Britain. This is in the later wing, the 1870s wing. And you can see that interwoven with all the stone Gothic detail is the iron structure of the staircase, very boldly exposed and celebrated. There are some sort of pressed plasterwork decoration applied to it, softening perhaps the outlines, but the bare bones of it are iron. Truly a remarkable space as well as a spectacular one. So now to what's happened since the 19th century. This is a photo in 1972 showing the hotel no longer used as a hotel. It had closed as such in the 1930s. As being sort of outdated and difficult to modernize when the railway was short of money for such things. And it had become offices. It was called St Pancras Chambers. And clearly no one had cleaned it for a very long time either. So a very grubby and rather neglected building, but at the same time, a remarkably intact building because it hadn't been modernized as it would have had to have been to continue in use as a hotel. And the train shed, well, this had suffered damage during the Second World War. It had been reglazed to a different pattern from the 19th century form, and to its detriment, really. It was murky as well as dirty, and the daylight, with the best use of the daylight not being made. This is a 1980s view. And then inside the hotel, well, in the 90s, the offices closed because they weren't compliant with fire regulations, and much of the building was already disused. But you could go around it, you could tour it. I took these photos in 2005, and you see quite a lot that was intact. That's the main entrance from the street with its original floor in beautiful condition. And then one of the bathrooms or lavatories with its original tiling, Minton tiling. Though clearly no longer in use as such. And the building was astonishing. It was full of, fossils, sort of time capsules, just like that. Those who got to see it then will always remember it. But not completely without use. It was very popular for a film set. So this is Batman Begins. There's that staircase again. There's Christian Bale or possibly a stunt double coming down the staircase at you. Gotham City Gothic, you might say. But by then things were already afoot. Change was afoot, and the key feature here, the key factor here, is the coming of the new Channel Tunnel rail link, HS1, the permanent high-speed line running from London to the Channel Tunnel. The Channel Tunnel and its services had opened in the 1990s, but originally running on existing tracks to a relatively short-lived terminus added alongside Waterloo Station on the South Bank. The new line was completely new, high speed all the way, and St Pancras was chosen after various other plans had been looked at and rejected because it was relatively underused and proved capable of adaptation. As long as one accepted that this was going to mean some really quite drastic changes to a Grade 1 listed building. So there was a trade-off. But part of the positive, part of the gain was the restoration of a building which was going to need a lot of work at some point relatively soon. The ironwork of the train shed was, in particular, was giving cause for concern. So the key asset was that basement, which had then been unused for quite a long time. And it was realized that by cutting slots into the deck, cutting through that original grid of ironwork, you could release it. You could get light down into it. Here are the escalators and the travelators running down for the Eurostar services, arrivals and departures. You could release that space, and you could also open it up to the surroundings. So this is a render, of course, before work had started. That shows you part of the uses to which the basement was being put. You could make shops in here. You could make it a destination in itself. And it's part of the city now. You can just walk into it from lots of different approaches, and it's thriving. And how to make it work for the trains? Well, the new Channel Tunnel trains were very long indeed. They were far too long to fit the existing platforms. So an extension was built, a big flat roofed one, adding on, building out into the sort of railway lands beyond. And by making it wider than the existing train shed, there was also space for the platforms for domestic services on the western side, the ones running up to the English Midlands, as they'd always done. On the eastern side, local services running out to Kent using the high-speed line. So there's a lot more going on. The station gets a lot more traffic. And there we see it as executed. It opened in 2007. And here we see those uprights again, the cast iron uprights from the beer basement. You can see on top of that is a new concrete floor. Effectively, this iron structure is no longer tying the whole thing together. It's concrete which is holding everything in place. And you can see the 19th century lighting arrangement restored. So natural light now floods into the space. It feels altogether different. And there we see it from the air. The flanks of the train shed on either side of that central glazing, these were reslated with Welsh slate, the proper historic material. Very, very costly and very well done. The stuff going on over here at King's Cross, which I'll come on to at the very end, because King's Cross is being transformed too. That's still in progress when that aerial view was taken. And to give another idea of how it works, this is the end of the train shed, the end of the 19th century station. There's the deck running out into the new extension, or the new additions to the platforms. And there's a sort of concourse running across in the middle, and it steps outwards. So this is the sort of one of the major public entrances. And you see the relationship between the old and the new enclosures there. And this is the basement as transformed. There is the concourse with the shops in it. And then there's a sort of cross concourse between the arrivals and departures side of the Eurostar services. And then there's all the basement of the new edition, for which there are shops and other uses have been found. In addition, there's a new connection made here with the London Underground, because to cope with the greatly expanded numbers, you can walk straight through into a very enhanced, much overhauled and expanded London Underground, basically tunneling and digging bigger routes and halls there. And there's another route just around here with steps going down, because that tunnel, the freight tunnel, which for a long time was disused, has come back to life. That line has been electrified and now runs right the way through London, the Thameslink service. And a new station was built there, providing other connections running outwards. So you can come off the Eurostar and you can catch the train north to Cambridge or somewhere south to Brighton. And this too is very intensively used. It's an intensification of everything the station is used for. And that excavations that made that possible, well, on top of that big sort of hole that was dug, then a new structure has risen, because the hotel has been brought back and the hotel needs more rooms, and therefore this is a way of providing those rooms, standard size rooms, very effectively and compactly. And these new sections are clad in a, if you like, sort of stripped down Scott Gothic version. This is the architect's Richard Griffiths, an early drawing, and this has been finished in a fine red brick. You wouldn't mistake it, I think, for the original work, but it has a sort of happy, it's in sympathy with it. So there we can see the whole scheme completed. There is the new range running that way. There were some losses of historic fabric here, clipping off some bits of the 19th century work, but they were not the most important or significant parts, and it was part of the trade-off, if you like. And there you see the main building and cleaned, in fact, earlier, cleaned in the 1990s, so the original polychromy and warm color coming back. I talked about it as converting it for the hotel. In fact, there's more going on. The company involved, the Manhattan Lofts Corporation, slightly misleadingly named, but as it's a British company, but founded by a New Yorker, Harry Handelsman, specialized in converting quite challenging and interesting buildings, up to that point largely as apartments. And in fact, the purple here are the bits which were turned into apartments, that you can now live here. The red sections are hotel bedrooms, so including some of the original hotel bedrooms, as you'll see. The grey sections are the public areas of the hotel, so the dining rooms and all the rest. So those parts have come back to their original use. But yeah, so here's one. This is what goes by what was actually a later name for it, the ladies' smoking room. There wouldn't have been ladies smoking in hotels in the 1870s, but by about 1900, that was okay, and that was the room the name it acquired. You'll see if you like, the level of unmodernization of the hotel. That ceiling is the original, or perhaps an early repainting of it. The dilemma for the conversion was how far to keep and restore what were often quite damaged, chipped away at decorative schemes. In this instance, you may be surprised, but it was covered over and repainted in a version of the original scheme because of areas of damage, essentially. But the old paint survives, under a sort of protective layer. Bottom left, you see a view in one of the corridors, and that in that instance, that one has been restored. So a mixed approach. And that does also show you the splendor of the grandest of the original hotel interiors. Other parts, well, this section effectively became redundant because the ramp running through, the end of it had gone, and the taxis were no longer coming up here and picking up, dropping off. So here's what became of it. There it is as it was, looking northward, and the ramp going down at the end. This is it as now. It has become the hotel's own reception area. You come in, there's the reception desk, and the rest is a sort of giant hotel lounge. And there you see the restored architecture of the sort of station side, the inner side, the eastern side. And there's next to that, so behind these windows is this space. That is the old booking office, now a rather nice restaurant. And just off here is the concourse. So you can step from the concourse into the restaurant. It's very permeable, if you like. If you're not intimidated by walking into places without ordering a drink or anything, you can walk right through, and you can walk right through the concourse and the lounge and out that way, and no one seems to mind. So it's made the building more appreciated, more visited, and more used. And just to finish, back to King's Cross. Well, similarly drastic renovation here. A new concourse, that was that addition you may have remembered from the earlier views, has been built on the flank. It has all that the modern station needs in terms of shops and restaurants and the like, and circulation space and waiting space. That means that the original frontage has been exposed and restored. So there it is below, as largely as designed. There it is at the top as now. In between times, there were all sorts of rather horrible makeshifts had spread all over that space. That space now is released effectively, has become a new public space for London. And a transformation as remarkable in its way as that which has rejuvenated St Pancras. So while so often those of us who love historic buildings lament and deplore what's happened to them, and while there have been, of course, some losses to the fabric and to the detail at both stations, overall, it's hugely enhanced them and secured their future for the long term. And I think now they're better understood and better appreciated. Both buildings in the 1960s, when the railways were contracting or trying to modernize in a more modest scale. Horrible to say, they were both threatened with demolition, and it could very nearly have happened. People rallied and defended them, and the railway changed its mind. But we're a long way from that now, and we can go forward with confidence with these two splendid buildings. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for that. And actually, one of the things which that reminds me of, particularly on the St Pancras side, is just how much, because of the simple way, as you explained at the beginning, that the railway arrived over the canal 20 feet up in the air, it made everything possible for St Pancras, and in a way was its salvation. It became a multi-layer building. I suppose it had been a multi-layer building before, but it's all beer barrels down there, and suddenly it became a concourse, which is not an outcome which was possible at King's Cross next door for the reasons that you outlined. So in a way, St Pancras had more going for it when it came to the transformation, which is why you're showing us that right at the end there, where they had to graft the concourse on the side of King's Cross, on the western side, in a rather ingenious geometrical way with some fiddles to make it work, has actually been tremendously successful. So that is, I think, amazing, particularly considering what you just said. And we all remember not only that demolition was proposed at one time, but also that a new superstation should be built here, which combined both of them together.
Yes.
And
yes.
And I suppose one bit which you didn't mention there, which I'd like to know a little bit more about, because the goods tunnel, which became the North-South Railway, Underground Railway, Thames Link, is of course very important. But there was a moment in the history of the evolution of these two stations when the Channel Tunnel trains were going to come straight through. I think I'm right in remembering that. Is that correct?
Yeah, there were lots of twists and turns. There was a proposal for an underground Channel Tunnel station in the space, in the land between the two 19th century termini. And that was in favour for I think a couple of years, but it would have been hugely expensive in terms of creating an attractive or an interesting environment. Well, that's problematic. I mean, the whole thing would have been underground, apart from some sort of surface structures. I think there were other options which have been explored. It partly tied in with what route the new line was going to take. The shortest route would have been to put it largely in tunnel, running straight through the middle of London. As it is, it runs in something more like an arc along the Thames for a while, and that was partly with the intention that it would help the route would help to regenerate deserving areas further down in what was often called the Thames Gateway back then. So there are a great many different factors involved, and all of this is going up to cabinet level, and the railways are being pulled this way and that, and the railways are also privatized in the 1990s, which doesn't exactly simplify things. So in terms of ownership and regulation and subdivision and perverse incentives and all the rest, then, well, it's remarkable that this actually did come about. But in terms of things like budgets and timings, actually they were pretty good when these were expensive projects, but they didn't get bogged down, and there wasn't really a loss of quality in terms of the actual outcomes. It's very hard to fault, actually, and on all the big points that matter.
I'll come to questions. By the way, all of you out there listening to this, if you've got a question, put it in the Q&A. There's some I'll come to in just a moment. I just say I'm a beneficiary of this scheme. I'm speaking to you from the Midlands now, and this is my railway line. This is the one I use all the time from St Pancras. So it's always an incredible thing to arrive and to depart from that station, I have to say. And you never get tired of it. There's a question, two questions at the moment here on the Q&A, and one actually is from John Peverley, and that is from a question I was going to ask. So I'll ask you because I suspect you may know, or it may be that nobody knows. He says, in the basement, you showed us a photograph of the columns, and that's where all the beer barrels were stacked up and being unloaded off the trucks. About halfway up the columns are brackets. What were these for? These brackets, of course, are still there. And I've been scratching my head over those. Do you know the answer to what they were for?
I think I can, yes, without giving a very detailed answer. I should say first, this is the question I've most often been asked
Oh, really?
when giving walks or tours about St Pancras. Everyone notices them and wonders what on earth were they for. But they seem to have been part of the arrangements for the hydraulic mechanism. If you don't know the ins and outs of hydraulics, then the system worked by a network of high pressure water pipes running through the structure, and that pressure was kept up by a great tower full of water with a great weight on the top, so pressing down, and the water was pumped in by a steam engine to keep the pressure up, and you could draw off that energy input, if you like, by releasing water to run through various gadgets and bits of equipment, especially to turn capstans, so things which would spin and pull ropes. So you could effectively turn on your capstan, it would pull a rope, and it would pull whatever you wanted to wherever you wanted. But getting all the pipes and so on through a structure, then the castings seem to have included provision for that. It's not as well recorded as the space in its original use as one would like. In fact, I think it's quite an obscure story, but those lugs seem to have been part of the provision for the hydraulics. Whether or not they were used or how far they were used as such, I'm not quite sure.
Ted, our chair here, says there's a dissonance between the original shed and the flat extension, the bit that they extended it without the back, and asks why wasn't the original shape mirrored by the addition? Alex, do you want to say something there? No, carry on.
Yeah, there were schemes to and designs that would have done that. So the idea was seriously looked at. From having seen photos of models and drawings and so on, there's something rather unhappy and unresolved about how it was done, and it was difficult to see how it could have been done. They couldn't have simply extended the train shed because it wouldn't have been wide enough. So anything you had to be wider. If you'd tried to, therefore, if you match the original proportions, then you'd have ended up with something much taller because, of course, it's starting from a wider span base. So they had to be sort of flatter, and somehow the two arched or curved spaces side by side just looked clunky in my view.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean it's one of those structures that's sort of supposed to be less obvious, but actually at the same time is really huge and unmissable. But it does mean that by keeping it low, then from within the 19th century train shed, you have preserved the relationship of that glazed screen wall at the north end with the outside world. You're still looking up to the sky through that glazed wall. And I think that's perhaps in the end, in terms of how one experiences the space, then that's the most important gain of the flat structure, which an arched or curved addition wouldn't have given you.
Exactly, and the top of the flat roof sits on the bottom chord of the arch, doesn't it? So it fits.
Yeah.
It fits with, as it were, the bowspring of the arch there. So yes, that seemed to be, and also I suppose if we're to talk about SBAB principles. And why not? You are expressing the new extension quite honestly, are you not? By doing it that way, you're not. I mean, you can argue this a number of ways, but yes, trains were much shorter back then than they are now, and the tracks do taper away at the back, so you couldn't really have extruded the whole thing backwards in that way. One other question which I have here is, you mentioned the height, and the height is, I think, if I can remember this one now, 104 feet.
That's it, yes.
And structurally speaking, is that dictated by the width? You were hinting at this just now. Is the height dictated by the width, or is there another reason for the chosen height?
Well, the height, I think that Barlow saw the height as a plus, because for reasons of airiness, let's say. And the point was his explanation. The pointed profile was he explained as making it stronger in terms of wind resistance. Now, these are sort of engineers' arguments, and I don't know whether that would hold up to experiments in a wind tunnel or anything like that. But yes, I mean, he could have rounded it off and still made a graceful sort of elliptical arch, I suppose, and had a different. Therefore had a lower profile. It wouldn't have been a very much lower profile. It would probably still have been the tallest train shed yet built. I think that height of 104 feet was matched by a later American example. I can't remember which one. But the point is, the pointed profile is a happy outcome, I think, in terms of the Gothic style of the rest of the building. If they happened by separate routes, then they've arrived at a common conclusion.
I've got a question here from Dennis DeWitt, who said, following on from that, I mean, didn't the height help with breathability, obviously, given the smoke, and was it vented?
Yeah, it wouldn't have had any artificial ventilation. You know, the whole of London, of course, is a very smoky place.
Yeah.
It's striking that at Euston, where the train shed began as a series of sort of pitch roofs in the 1830s, and the station then just expanded and expanded while keeping that sort of pitch roof, quite narrow system of aisles, you might say. Then as locomotives became bigger and smokier, then the decision was taken that to jack the whole thing up, to add, I can't remember, about 6 feet or something, so that all the uprights were raised up on I think masonry platforms, so the whole thing was less choked with smoke and steam. So yes, it was, although it was grubby and grimy, I mean, I remember it when before the extension was built, and you had the sense that you were outside within that train shed rather more than in certain others. Victoria might felt a bit sort of I wouldn't say cozy, but you didn't have the sense of the chill of the outside world on a cold day nearly to the same extent.
Yeah, it was open right at the back, and you certainly felt the draft in there. I had a question. We've been talking so far about Barlow and Ordish's shed, really, and what lay and lies beneath it. When it comes to the hotel, I have a memory that, as you say, it became offices, but that one of the reasons it fell out of use as being a hotel was simply because it was not particularly sumptuously provided with restrooms, bathrooms, and so forth, and that this was a difficulty. It's because it's quite a narrow plan,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah,
actually, didn't convert terribly easily to modern standards.
Yeah, it could. It's a sense of, in one sense, it's sort of how much you want to spend. I mean, putting in more lifts would have, I think, been more difficult and expensive structurally than putting in more bathrooms. Everyone's familiar with the sort of modern hotel converted from a house or something where there's that bathroom enclosure right by the door where you come in. You can do it. But there were other factors in play. I mean, one was that when it was built, it was the grandest and most expensive hotel in London. But it was built just before people began to have higher expectations of bathrooms and lifts. And therefore, in terms of the investment cycle, you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't remodel your hotel after 10 years, 20 years. But by the 1880s, new hotels were being built with those things in some numbers, and you'd sort of fallen behind. You'd have to, in the 1880s, I found a pamphlet for the American market advertising the hotel, And rather than saying, you know, grandest, most expensive in London, it says rooms at moderate prices or something like that. So they were cutting their prices because they were no longer competing in terms of, you know, they still had these grand rooms, public rooms. Yes, I mean there were, you know, there were some updatings, but in the 1920s, the Midland Railway was grouped with its old rival, the London and North Western Railway, which was the railway that had Euston Station. It already had a very big hotel there, and the company didn't want to invest in two hotels side by side, so it chose to update Euston, then demolished in the 1960s, and that became its flagship hotel. And St Pancras was just left to, you know, I won't say rot, but it was neglected. And then the decision in the 1930s that they only really needed one big London hotel, and St Pancras would be more of an asset to as offices. Well, in retrospect, it saved a lot which would otherwise have been lost. So it's a happy outcome in the longest term.
There is, by the way, there was no time to show it here, but there is a most astonishing apartment in the clock tower at the eastern end of the station there, on many levels, with the clock mechanism within the flat and ladders going up to it and stuff like that. So privately owned, but sometimes perhaps on an open house weekend or whatever, one might be able to get back in there again. But it did make a quite extraordinary apartment, and you showed us that layer cake.
Yes, I know the one you mean, and I've been there too. Yes, if you get the chance, then jump at the chance.
Yes, exactly. So, well, thank you very much for showing us Gotham City Gothic as you memorably described it.
Very good. Thank you. I'd like to thank both Simon and Hugh for what's been a fascinating program. Very, very interesting. Thank you. And to follow on your comments, Hugh, the fourth and final lecture of the series, Upscale Express, How the Elizabeth Line Transformed Public Transport in London, will be presented on Thursday, April 24. Hugh will be our speaker, and Otto Smith will be our interlocutor. Additionally, information on the British Architectural Library Trust, its activities and programs, and other lectures and presentations sponsored by the Trust can be found on our website, thebaltrust.org. And I just take this opportunity to thank everyone for joining us.